University College London. His PhD history is from Suez, entitled The Political Imaginations of Bombay's Textile Workers, 1928-45. Subsequently, Dr. Alkazi is currently settled in New Delhi, where he is continuing his research on the history of labor in Mumbai, what we now know as Mumbai. And he's also pursuing his journalistic stories on contemporary labor issues, such as the impact of the ongoing privatization of the Indian railways on railway workers and the living and working conditions of workers in Delhi NCR area. If you scroll his academia page, you will come across some papers which are uploaded there for detail. Of course, you can check over there as well. However, the contemporary interest of his work is so engaging in light of the fact that what the pandemic caused as massive disruption in our economy and in the life process of the working population in South Asia manifested in such a large scale of forced return migration and the plight of those migrant working population, that it has generated a significant amount of concern and also interest in examining the social security architecture in our country, and at the same time all other aspects contributing to that kind of vulnerable existence and uncared existence of the working population, especially in the informal sector. That is his current area of interest. And the railway, of course, is one of the largest employers in our country, and also witnessing the impact of what we call deregulation or privatization and contractualization in the sector. But today, what we are going to hear from him is one of the popular areas of a study, that is the Bombay textile working population, the working population in the city of Bombay. There are a number of scholars who have done studies over the entire century on this subject, starting from the work done by trade unionists in 1920s and onwards, and then taken up by academicians, among whom Rajchandra Varkar is one of the most well-known for voluminous contribution made to this subject. And then there are a couple of others who have also of late worked on this subject. So today, now we are looking forward to the presentation from Zain Alkazi on this interface between labor history and social history. And while he is presenting, I will request you all to just mute your speaker so that there is no background noise interfering. And whenever you have anything to add and discuss something or share your view, you can unmute yourself and come in. So I hand over to Zain. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. So I'd like to start off by thanking Professor Knight and Professor Kotial for making today's talk possible. I'm very honored and grateful to have the opportunity of presenting at Ambedkar University. I have a longish presentation today, so I'm going to get straight into it. But I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is that today's work is very much a work in progress. So, I mean, I say that to kind of indicate that I really look forward to your comments and suggestions for further reading in the discussion that follows. So if you just give me a second, I'll share my screen and I'll start off. Can you see this?
Yes, yeah, we can see that.
Okay, I'll start off. Thank you. So in today's paper, I will explore labor and depressed classes militancy through the study of a type of militaristic organization that arose in the interwar period, volunteer movements. Volunteer movements were movements that, In their military-inspired hierarchy of generals, captains, sergeants, martial symbolism, and activities such as drilling, flag salutations, and presenting guards of honor emulated army service. Interwar class struggle was characterized in part by the presence of such organizations in South Asia and beyond. Today's paper uses industrial Bombay as its vantage point to question two ways in which the existing literature has framed these movements. So, first, volunteer movements are often framed within a global interwar moment of fascism and the perceived threat of an approaching Second World War or partition. For instance, scholars have explored the links between South Asian volunteer corps and European fascists, and how volunteer corps mobilized in preparation for an expected inter-imperialist or intercommunal war. While this framing is undoubtedly correct, such perspectives have left largely unexplored the link between volunteer movements and First World War military service. In today's paper, I will demonstrate that a section of Bombay's working class and a number of leading figures in Workers' Volunteer Corps had served in the British Army during the war. Following on from this, I will argue that volunteer corps should be seen, at least in part, as a form of politics adopted by soldiers returning from battlefields in the Middle East and Europe. In considering the overlap between colonial soldiering and wage labor, today's paper is an exploration of the political implications of the itineracy of labor. Exploring the movements of labor has a special significance in South Asia, where the majority of workers are what Jan Bremen has called footloose labor, or workers who work in a number of different occupations in multiple geographic sites through their working lives. Second, volunteer movements are often framed by the late colonial context of communal mobilization in the towns and cities of the subcontinent. For instance, scholars have explored the relation between increasingly large scales of volunteer mobilization and the networking of communal violence between spaces, and the pre-partitioning of cities into Hindu and Muslim neighborhoods through the activity of communal volunteer corps. However, labor history has demonstrated that if late colonialism was a period of the development of communal organizations and riots, it was also a period of the organization of the first mass trade unions and some of the largest strikes in South Asian history. This fact begs the question, can we frame volunteer movements within this context of late colonial class struggle? In today's paper, I will argue that the emergence and activities of volunteer corps can be linked to class struggle by demonstrating that late colonial Bombay was host to both trade union and depressed classes volunteer corps, which played an active role in labor militancy, and middle class corps that sought to discipline and control labor. So today's paper is organized into two sections. The first section will explore the activities of the Lal Fauj, the Red Army, the volunteer corps of the Girni Kamgar Union, or Textile Workers Union, during the general strikes of 1928-29. The second section will explore the activities of the Samta Sainik Dal, or the Equality Soldiers Force, the volunteer corps of the Ambedkarite movement, through the depressed classes labor militancy of the period from 1927 to 38. In the conclusion, I will discuss the implications of my findings for the historiography of South Asian labor and volunteer movements. Okay, so to begin with, the Lal Fauj, the volunteer corps of the Kamgar Union. The Kamgar Union was organized by communists such as S.S. Miradskar and mill worker activists influenced by the non-Brahmin movement, such as the weaver A.A. Alve, during a textile general strike in 1928. The Fauj was formed by Miradskar, Alve, and G.L. Kandalkar, a jobber from the Simplex mills, who, in emulation of military hierarchy, was designated captain of the corps. Volunteers wore a uniform of khaki shirts and red sashes while drilling with lathis in military formation outside chawls union offices, and mills in the city. The forge was the crystallization of connections being made in the 1920s between military service, mill labor, neighborhood gymnasia or akhadas, trade unions, and volunteer corps. Following Alve's career closely shows us how soldiers returning from the First World War were forging these links and transforming the city's politics. Alve, like many others, left his native village in the Ratnagiri district to work in Bombay's mills sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1916, he saw the Bombay police and a non-Brahmin workers' welfare organization, the Kamgar Hitavardhak Sabha, recruiting for the army at the mill gates. Alve joined and convinced 130 other workers to sign up with him. Like Alve, many other Maratha workers joined the British Army during the war. For a large proportion of Bombay's workers came from the Maratha caste, which had been classified as a martial race and recruited in increasing numbers into the army from the 1880s. And the Bombay mills, as well as regiments such as the Maratha Light Infantry, both recruited from the same districts of Bombay province: Satara, Kolhapur, Khandesh, and Nashik. Dressed in military uniform and organized into the Maratha regiment, Alve and other workers left Bombay port for Mesopotamia, where they fought Ottoman and Imperial German troops. Once demobilized, Alve disembarked at Bombay port to rejoin the mills. To get a job, he might have used the services of the Young Men's Christian Association, which had been charged by the Bombay Soldiers Board with finding work for these returning soldiers. Back in the mill, Alve, like other ex-soldiers, got involved in a number of trade union initiatives and the non-cooperation movement, picketing liquor and foreign cloth shops. In this period, the first volunteer corps were formed, the Hindustan Seva Dal and the Khilafat Corps. In 1923, while working in the Crown Mill, Alve, along with other skilled workers, formed the Girni Kamgar Mahamandal, or the Textile Workers Grand Association. Alve organized an akhada in the working class neighborhood of Prabha Devi, conducted clandestine meetings in the chawls, and the Mahamandal led the 1925 textile general strike. The Mahamandal had its own volunteer corps, which protected union meetings and participated in the celebrations of the birth centenary of the Maratha king Shivaji Bhosle in 1927. Thus, we can see through following Alve, we can see the links between a number of institutions and events which crystallized in the formation of the forge: mill work, military service with the Maratha regiment in Mesopotamia, textile trade unionism, akhadas, and volunteer corps. It was in the following year, 1928, that another general strike broke out in the industry. The forge was formed during the rapid expansion of the Kamgar Union in an exceptional period of class struggle after this strike. In April 1928, 150,000 mill workers went on strike protesting the intensification of work and job losses. In the following month, Mahamandal leaders such as Alve joined communists in launching the Kamgar Union. After the end of the strike in October, workers protested changes to the work process through open defiance, strikes, and violence against mill officials. Managers bemoaned the complete collapse of their authority. Mill workers joined the Kamgar Union en masse, swelling its membership to 100,000 by December, and mill committees of worker activists were elected in mass meetings in most of the city's mills. At this point, the mill owners retaliated. Dada Borkar, a neighborhood Dada or strongman, jobber, and superintendent of labor at the Sassoon mills, attacked 3 Kamgar union leaders. In protest, 5,000 workers ransacked Borkar's house, burnt his belongings, raided his akhada, and brought workers out on strike. They were marching with a red flag to the union headquarters when the police fired on them, killing 4. It was in the aftermath of the Borkar attack that Kamgar union leaders organized the Forge. The first task of the volunteers was to protect the union. Consider, for instance, the role of volunteers during the February 1929 riots. On 4th February, as the rumor spread through the mill areas that Pathans were kidnapping children, textile workers stopped attending work to guard their chawls, creating a tense situation in the city. On that day, a group of Pathans attacked the Kamgar Union office. The Forge repulsed the attack with their lathis, leading behind them 3,000 mill workers. In the coming days, union leaders deputed Forge volunteers to patrol and protect workers' neighborhoods so that they could go to work. Reassured, workers attended the mills and rioting ended in workers' neighborhoods. In addition to protecting the union and workers' neighborhoods in this way, Forge volunteers were activists for the Kamgar Union. They picketed mill gates, gave speeches, and acted as an information collection and dissemination network between the union leadership and the neighborhood and mill committees. This army of worker activists was active for almost a year until the repressive aftermath of another textile general strike in 1929. With the formation of the Forge, labor assertion and control became the axis on which volunteer corps mobilized and counter-mobilized in the city. For after the mill workers had formed their trade union volunteer corps, the mill owners counter-mobilized, organizing their trade union, the Girni Kamgar Hitsang Neela Bafta Union, or the Textile Workers Blue Flag Union, which had its own uniform blue flag volunteer corps. This union was formed by managers and employees in the head office of E.D. Sassoon and Co. The groundwork of distributing leaflets and organizing the volunteer corps was done by Milton Cubes, supervisor of the Watch and Wards Department and a well-known boxer, and Babaji Rane, an ex-policeman. Blue Flag volunteers organized counter-picketing and intelligence to the Kamgar Union and frequently clashed with the Forge. The presence of the Lal Forge and ex-soldiers in Kamgar Union work brought military politics and language to this period of class struggle. Speaking at a union meeting, the Kamgar Union leader and mill fitter, G.L. Kasle, invoked workers' war service and their martial race status as Marathas as claims on the loyalty of the colonial state. He stated, and I quote, "When government were in difficulty, they praised us as Maratha Marda, Maratha Bahadur, manly Maratha, brave Maratha, and begged us for help. We sprinkled our blood on the battlefield for this government, and now they are dragging their sword against us in order to defend these capitalists who were of no use to them in the battlefield." End quote. Statements such as these should be seen in the context of a more general invocation of soldiering in the literature of the time. For instance, the names of workers' newspapers recalled army service and volunteering, such as Lal Paltan or Red Platoon and Veer Swayam Sevak or Brave Volunteer. The Kamgar Union leadership also portrayed itself and the general strike in military terms. In January 1929, the Kamgar leader S.S. Mirazkar chose a gun as his symbol for the Bombay municipal elections. In February, the Kamgar Union published the Girni Kamgar Phataka, or the mill workers' poem, in pamphlet form. The poem reads, and I quote, "The heroes of the mills came out and laid siege to the city of Bombay. An assemblage was formed, and the sea of the army was filled in a furious manner at the time. An army consisting of 1.5 lakh is marching forward to swallow capitalism. Only the old men and children were left out. The youths rushed filled with heroic sentiments. The mill workers with their banners, the heroic followers of Alve and those of Zoglekar and Mirazkar vie with one another. The sword of Mirazkar does not rest satisfied in its scabbard. That of Dange is really electricity, and it goes one better than lightning. and the army of Lalji Pense and Krishna Arsekar, making real preparations, take part in the procession in an orderly manner. Come along, warriors, come to the battle. A bloody struggle is taking place. Look, look, how the enemies have led a counter-attack and are assailing us on all four sides. O you soldiers, workers of the new spirit and new discipline. End quote. The war imagery here is evident. The Union is portrayed as a mill workers' army, organized into regiments led by heroic trade union leaders with banners flying. The class struggle is portrayed as a war position conducted by the movement of battalions. Despite its brief existence, the forge may have had an impact beyond Bombay through the movements of footloose labor. In the repressive aftermath of the 1929 strike, 4,000 mill committee members, some of whom had probably also been members of the forge, migrated to other textile towns in western India, such as Chalisgaon, Jalgaon, Amalner, Dhulia, Sholapur, Nagpur, and Indore, to set up or strengthen red flag trade unions there. In Bombay, red trade union volunteers re-emerge with the revival of mill workers' militancy, collecting funds for unemployed mill workers in 1934. A decade later, in 1938, another Lal Forge was organized in the Kanpur mills. Even if Bombay's Red Army was quickly suppressed, it may have had a wide and lasting significance. The Samta Sainik Dal was formed on the eve of the Mahad Satyagraha in 1927 by Mahar ex-soldiers and workers. Mahad was a military town in the North Konkan from which workers migrated to work in Bombay and serve in the army. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was invited to chair a conference here on the subject of opening the local lake for use by the depressed classes from which they had been barred by caste Hindus. The month before the conference saw intensive campaigning in the surrounding villages and workers' neighborhoods in Bombay, during which the Dr. Ambedkar Seva Dal was formed on 13 March 1927. Soon after, the Seva Dal changed its name to the Samta Sainik Dal. The Dal was formed and led by a serving Mahar soldier, Subedar V.G. Savadkar of the 2x9 Jat Regiment, and a Mahar worker, R.B. Mode. This leadership reflected the membership of the Dal in Bombay, which included Mahar soldiers and war veterans, and Bombay's hospital, municipal, and possibly mill, railway, and Royal Indian Navy dockyard workers. By 1938, the Dal had around 2,500 members in the city. The Dal was the crystallization of links between Mahar soldiers, footloose labor, the depressed classes movement, and labor militancy in the first decades of the 20th century. We can observe how footloose workers were forging these links through following R.B. Mode's career closely. Mode grew up within a military milieu, which was the product of Mahar recruitment into the East India Company and then British Army since the early 19th century. In the villages of Western India, Mahars were placed beneath the caste hierarchy and required to perform 52 ritually stigmatized forms of labor, including the skinning of dead cattle. Philip Constable has convincingly argued that through the 19th century, British military service gave Mahars access to stable jobs, education, and a sense of pride and dignity by allowing them to escape the humiliations of this village caste hierarchy and labor. However, this window of emancipation closed in 1892 when Mahars were deemed unfit for British Army service due to Maratha pressure. Mahar soldiers had to return to their villages and resume caste labor in a context where Brahminical Hindu norms were more rigidly institutionalizing their untouchability. Again, in 1918, the 111th Mahar Regiment was constituted by the British Army and Mahar soldiers served in the Battle of Verdun between the Allied and German armies. But in 1920, the Mahar regiment was disbanded and demobilized Mahars returned to farm and manual labor. This history of military recruitment created a politically significant Mahar military milieu in Western India, part of which settled in and around Mode's village. Among them, the depressed classes activist and ex-soldier Baba Valankar. While growing up, Mode dreamed of serving in the army and attended the village akhada, learning to use wooden swords and daggers. In 1917, Mode came to Bombay and stayed in the family Lions Chawl, the majority of whose inhabitants worked for the army. It was here that he met Dr. B.R. Ambedkar at a meeting organized by the Brigade Caste Panchayat, an organization of military men. Thereafter, Modi joined the ranks of depressed classes footloose labor in Western India, which was concentrated in industrial Bombay. Modi worked in his native Dasgaon as a cowherd and farm laborer, then in Bombay as a seaman's cashier, and then a coolie at the docks, on ships, and in railway stations, and finally in the Khidki arsenal near Pune as a waiter in a soldier's canteen, and then a petty supervisor. Mode's experience was similar to that of many other Mahars at the time, who were leaving their villages and traditional stigmatized occupations. By the 1930s, Mahars were the most proletarianized of all the depressed classes in Bombay city, constituting 92% of all depressed classes workers in the city's mills, railways, dockyards, and buses, working as motor mechanics, scavengers, sweepers, rag pickers, laundrywomen, sex workers, junk dealers, and casual laborers. In the early 1920s, Modi became an activist for the depressed classes movement in Mahad, organizing the Mahad Satyagraha and the Samta Sainik Dal. In the aftermath of the Satyagraha, Mahars from the surrounding villages refused to skin cattle, an act which caste Hindus revealingly referred to as a strike. In the following years, impressed by the 1928 mill strike, during which the Lal Fauj was formed, Modi became an activist in Bombay's trade union movement, organizing the Gilni Kamgar Union Red Flag, GIP Railway Workers Union, and trade unions of sanitation workers, municipal school teachers, liftmen, pressmen, watchmen, and construction workers. Thus, through Modi's career, we can see how the connections between Mahar soldiers, footloose labor, the depressed classes movement, and labor militancy, made in the first decades of the 20th century, crystallized in the Samta Sainik Dal. Considering the history of military service as partial caste emancipation for Mahars, we can see the Dal's militaristic organization as a protest against Mahar's exclusion from the colonial army. In emulation of military dress and organization, Dal members wore a uniform of a red shirt and khaki shorts, with slight modifications of dress between superior officers, non-officers, and Sainiks, and were organized into sections, platoons, companies, battalions, and regiments. In emulation of military ceremony, the Dal organized drills, parades, and flag salutations outside chawls and factories, and presented guards of honor to Ambedkar. Moreover, at this time, the reconstitution of the Mahar regiment became a persistent demand in the depressed classes movement, and Ambedkar's rallies at the Koregaon Battle Memorial recalled the Mahar community's pride in the victory of the East India Company's Mahar troops over the Brahminical Peshwai in 1818. The Dal played an important part in depressed classes labor militancy in the 1930s. Dal volunteers helped in forming unions, protecting union meetings, and distributing and reading out newspapers to workers. The period from 1927 to 38 saw a number of important strikes of depressed classes workers, including the textile strikes of 1928 and 34, the GIP railway strike, the municipal worker strikes of 1932-33, and tannery worker strikes. Trade unionism was part and parcel of this strike wave. S.V. Parulekar organized the Dharavi Tannery and Leather Workers Union. Ambedkar organized the Mumbai Municipal Kamgar Sangh, and there were significant numbers of Ambedkarite mill and railway workers by 1938. By 1940, Ambedkar's Independent Labour Party had also organized the Oil Workers Union, Engineering Workers Union, Bombay Transport Coolies Union, and the Tramway Kamgar Sangh. In this context of rising depressed classes labor assertion, the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate over separate electorates became an occasion for the mobilization and counter-mobilization of volunteer corps in the city. During the first roundtable conference in 1930-31, Gandhi opposed Ambedkar's demand for separate electorates for the depressed classes, arguing that they would divide the Hindu community and provoke caste violence. In 1932, Gandhi forced Ambedkar to accept his position by going on a hunger fast. I would like to point out that placed within the context of depressed classes labor militancy, we can see that the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate was at least partly about labor control. For, as Anupama Rao has argued, by claiming that separate electorates for the depressed classes would provoke violence, Gandhi made it invisible the routine violence of caste Hindu society, which kept the depressed classes in their place, or put differently, in their occupations. Furthermore, in claiming that the issue of the depressed classes was a matter internal to the Hindu community, which could be resolved by sanctifying the labor of the depressed classes, Gandhi was trying to ensure that they remained in their traditional caste occupations. Sainik Dal volunteers took the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate into the chawls and factories of Bombay by selling and reading out both Ambedkar's Janta and R.B. More's Ahvan newspapers to groups of workers in public spaces and performing plays and poetry. William Gold has shown how in the United Provinces, Gandhi's rhetoric of a religion in danger allowed for links to be made between Congress and Hindu volunteer corps. This was the case in Bombay as well, where the counter-mobilization of middle-class Congress and Hindu volunteer corps made visible the threat of violence against depressed classes assertion in the city. We can see this by looking at two organizations, the Desh Sevika Sangh and the Swastik League. During the civil disobedience movement in 1930, middle-class Congress women volunteers organized the Desh Sevika Sangh, or Organization of Women Who Serve the Nation. The Sangh had a membership of 300 women who were hierarchically organized into squads commanded by local senapatis and wore saffron saris, which recalled the practice of Johar, or the self-immolation of Rajput women to protect their honor in the face of an approaching army. Geraldine Forbes has shown that the Sangh only recruited ladies from the respectable classes and actively excluded undesirable women of the lower classes. Indeed, the Sangh was led by Dadabhai Nauroji's granddaughters, Goshiben and Perinben Captain, who prided themselves on being the sisters of one of the first Indian commissioned officers of the British Army during the war. And Sevikas came from the city's business and professional families of mill owners, merchants, lawyers, and journalists. During the disobedience movement, the Sevikas were prominent in salt making, door-to-door Swadeshi propaganda, and picketing toddy shops. However, during Gandhi's fast on the issue of separate electorates, the Sangh transformed from a nationalist to a caste Hindu organization by shifting their attentions away from the colonial state and toward the depressed classes workers of the city. The Sangh changed its name to the Gandhi Seva Sena, or the Gandhi Social Service Army. Sevikas distributed literature and organized meetings, prayers, and kirtans, propagating Gandhi's position in municipal workers' chawls in Mazgaon, Baikala, Mahalakshmi, and Prabhadevi. Prominent congressmen attended who had in this period started using the prefix sergeant before their names. Other More openly Hindu corps were also formed in this period. In 1929, the Swastik League was founded by M.R. Jayakar of the Hindu Mahasabha and other wealthy professionals. Its leaders, Lieutenant Colonel A.B. Gajendra Gadkar and Captain Dr. G.B. Gole, had served in Mesopotamia in the First World War. The League had its headquarters in the Seth Vajivan Das Motilal Swastik Mandir, advertised as a, quote, temple of discipline and physical culture, which was named after a funder and prominent cotton exporter in the city in middle class Girgaon. The organization was patronized by the royalty of Western India's princely states, such as the Chief of Phaltan, Dowager Rani Sahib of Jat, the Maharajas of Bansda and Tripura, and Colonel Sir Kailas Haksar. The League's volunteers paraded in their military uniforms of khaki helmets, shirts, shorts, and boots bi-weekly and on Hindu festivals. In 1934, the League hosted lectures by the Hindu Mahasabha ideologue B.S. Munje, himself a veteran of the Boer War, on the militarization of Hindus. In the same year, the League sought to retain the depressed classes in Hinduism by organizing caste interdining, providing medical services such as an ambulance and smallpox vaccination in depressed classes workers' neighborhoods, and organizing protection for Harijan Sevak Sangh meetings in cooperation with the Gandhi Seva Sena and Hindu akhadas in the city. In passing, I would like to suggest that we see middle class volunteer corps, such as the Sevika Sangh and the Swastik League, as militaristic and aggressive transformations of the social uplift movements of the 1920s in the face of labor and depressed classes' assertion. Scholars such as Prashant Kidambi have shown how the uplift movements of the 1920s were middle class and upper caste efforts by institutions such as the Social Service League to discipline the poor and transform them into obedient labor for industry. In the 1930s, the Desh Sevika Sangh and the Swastik League adopted many of the activities of social uplift, organizing community libraries, skilling classes, and running medical programs. However, efforts at control were now more explicitly disciplinarian. The Sevika Sangh became the Seva Sena and protected Congress meetings with Hindu corps and akhadas. The League paraded in military uniform on the edge of Bombay's industrial areas. It seems the helping hand of uplift now brandished a lathi. To return to our narrative. In the context of mushrooming volunteer corps around the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate, we see the development of distinctively militaristic forms of mobilization in the city in the 1930s. Consider one form, the presentation of guards of honor. This form of honoring a state functionary was standard state practice in colonial Bombay. Army Corps would often receive British and other heads of state in this way at Ballard Pier. From at least 1927 onward, we see volunteer corps in the city emulating this form of politics. The Sainik Dal presented guards of honor and blue bugles to honor Ambedkar at Ballard Pier on his way to Mahad in 1927, and again in the early 1930s on his departure and return from the Round Table conferences in London. In 1938, the Dal presented a guard of honor for Bhagoji Wagmare, a depressed classes mill worker who was killed in a police firing during a strike. The Swastik League presented guards of honor for an array of Congress and Hindu Mahasabha figures. This form of politics could lead to clashes between volunteer corps. For example, in December 1931, when Gandhi landed in the city, over 10,000 Ambedkarites, including Dal members, organized a black flag demonstration shouting "Boycott Gandhi" and "Ambedkar ki Jai." They clashed with 1,500 Desh Sevikas and other Congress volunteers who had assembled to receive Gandhi, leaving 40 injured. When Ambedkar returned from the conference a month later, he was received by 4,000 Samta Sainiks in military uniform, who presented him a guard of honor. Such volunteer corps mobilization and militaristic forms of organization influenced mass workers' actions. In November 1938, the Independent Labour Party and the Bombay Provincial Trade Union Congress called a one-day strike to protest a trade union act introduced by the recently elected Bombay Congress Ministry. In the run-up to the strike, Samta Sainiks were part of workers' chawl committees which propagandized for the strike, and Sainiks protected depressed classes meetings and broke Congress meetings. These Sevikas toured the mill areas propagandizing against the strike. On the day, uniformed Sainiks with lathis led groups of thousands of workers, which included mill, tannery, railway workshop, and transport workers, laskars, and sweepers, on attacks on Congress activists, mills, and mill officials. In this case, it seems that the Sainik Dal's emulation of the police and army serves to have undermined the authority of the Bombay police in the eyes of the workers. For police officers repeatedly mentioned that on the day of the strike, their uniforms and guns no longer intimidated large numbers of workers. Consider events at the spring mills. When mill officials tried to lead strikebreakers home, striking workers threw stones at them. When an officer and policemen came to their assistance, the carding master of the mill stated that, and I quote, the police's presence did not subdue the stone throwing. Under normal circumstances, their presence generally subdues the stone throwing. End quote. Even when the police fixed bayonets, quote, that did not stop the crowd. Sergeant Waller of the Bombay Police further reported that when workers came within a distance of 30 yards or so, I shouted to them to stop throwing stones. I was there in my uniform and they knew at whom they were throwing stones. I fired on the crowd with my revolver. The effect was momentarily to check them for about 5 seconds or so. Immediately after that, they actually came to us. I again fired 6 rounds at them. That did not even check them. It had no effect whatever. End quote. Similarly, Sergeant Keys claimed that when he arrived with reinforcements at the Elphinstone Mills to protect police who were being stoned by workers, I quote, I just drew my revolver in order to see what effect it would have on the crowd. The answer was utter defiance. They challenged me to open fire. End quote. Could it be that the presence of the Samta Sainik Dal, their uniforms and lathis, actually served to undermine the authority of the police uniforms and guns in the eyes of the assembled workers? I leave this question open. Okay, so to conclude, in today's paper, I have shown how the First World War cast its shadow over interwar politics in Bombay. First, I have shown how workers served as soldiers in the Maratha and Mahar regiments during the war and participated in trade union and depressed classes volunteer corps in the interwar period. Once we acknowledge the itineracy of Bombay labor in this way and discover that a section of Bombay's workers were ex-soldiers, we find that the field of what constitutes workers' politics expands. For military service influenced the way Bombay's workers articulated their politics. In the mill strikes of 1928-29, trade union leaders claimed that workers were being betrayed by the very colonial state whose army generals had praised them as martial Marathas on the battlefield of the war. Union poems described the Kamgar Union as an army organized into regiments led by trade union leaders at war with the mill owners of Bombay. The Samta Sainik Dal recalled the Mahar regiment, protesting its disbandment by the British authorities. In emulation of army practice, Dal members drilled in uniform in front of chawls and factories, organized flag salutations, and presented guards of honor for Ambedkar and martyred mill workers. Workers thereby demonstrated that they saw themselves not only as labor, but also as ex-soldiers. The war seems to have cast its shadow over interwar politics in other industrial centers as well. For Lahore, Ahmad Azhar has shown how this military connection impacted the performative aspect of railway workshop strikes, such as when workers fired upon the railway management with their mock weapons or rallied behind the trade unionist General Miller on horseback with a bugle in his hand. For Kanpur, both Chitra Joshi and Nandini Guptu's work have shown how the Mazdoor Sabha had a volunteer corps in the 1920s and how in 1938 mill workers formed their own Lal Fauj, which similarly drilled, organized flag salutations, and even had a youth and women's section. What are the implications of this militarization of labor movements? Should we, for instance, study volunteer corps as particularly authoritarian or hierarchical modes of workers' politics? I leave these questions open. I would like to suggest that volunteer movements should be seen in part as a form of politics adopted by these returning soldiers. If ex-soldiers became workers and leaders of trade union and depressed classes corps, ex-generals such as A.B. Gajendra Gatkar and G.B. Gole, and the sisters of one of the first Indian officers of the British Army formed middle-class corps, such as the Swastik League and the Desh Sevika Sangh. The fact that other centers of volunteer activity, such as Punjab and the United Provinces, were also important recruitment areas for the British Army lends further weight to this hypothesis. The political significance of returning soldiers suggests further questions for research. How did the regional, religious, and caste identities fostered by India's military, for example, the notion of martial races, transform Bombay's neighborhood networks of mandalis, panchayats, and akhadas and shape interwar politics? And how did the experience of war, of a rigidly hierarchical military structure, combat on the battlefield, and post combat trauma shape interwar politics in South Asia? Volunteer corps have been studied in large part as self contained organizations of combatants. My paper suggests that in moments of action, these corps could pull thousands of workers behind them. The attack on Pathans, led by the Lal Fauj in 1929, and the groups of workers led by uniformed Sainik Dal members during the 1938 strike, show that these organizations could lead and coordinate the activities of large numbers of workers. The presence of volunteer corps in these moments of mass action seem to have contributed to the breakdown of conventional forms of authority. William Gold has argued that the presence of volunteer corps introduced an alternative notion of sovereignty in late colonial India. The Lal Fauj was formed amidst the widespread breakdown of Dada, moneylender, managerial, and police authority in the mill areas. Further research will reveal how the presence of the Fauj contributed to this moment of breakdown. The presence of the Sainik Dal during the 1938 strike may have played a role in undermining the authority of the police. Thus, the presence of armed and uniformed workers in moments of mass class struggle seems to have undermined conventional symbols and figures of authority. Moreover, volunteers were activists in a broader sense than just being combatants. This has been recognized by Roy and Raza, who argue that volunteer corps were, and I quote, laboratories where ideas about the nation, the state, citizenship, and political participation were articulated and enacted. My paper suggests that volunteers were not only the object of, but also vectors for such projects and ideas. The Lal Fauj organized mill picketing, collected union funds, spoke at meetings, and acted as an intelligence network for the Kamgar Union. The Sainik Dal organized neighborhood meetings and read out newspapers. Volunteers should be considered an important conduit for the popularization and dissemination of political projects and ideas in late colonial South Asia. Viewed as activists, volunteer movements can be connected more easily with other movements on the subcontinent. For example, I have suggested we think of some middle class volunteer corps in the 1930s as transformations of the social uplift movements of the 1920s in the face of depressed classes and labor assertion. Finally, volunteer corps have been studied primarily within the framework of late colonial communal mobilization. In particular, scholars often frame the mobilization and counter mobilization of corps as part of rising communal tensions in the run up to partition. My paper has shown that in industrial Bombay, volunteer movements were pulled into the whirlpool of industrial conflict. And this process of mobilization and counter mobilization seems to have taken place around the axis of class struggle. The Lal Forge was the core of the Guinea Kamgar Union, and its activities were tied to the 1928-29 textile strikes. The mill owners backed Blue Flag volunteers were a counter mobilization, an attempt at re-establishing labor control in the mill areas. The Sainik Dal was involved in trade union formation, and the 1938 strike, which protested a trade union law. The Desh Sevika Sangh / Gandhi Seva Sena and the Swastik League transformed themselves, at least in part, to re-establish caste and more generally labor control. However, the fact that the Sena and the League were closely linked to, or themselves communal organizations, suggests that we do not have two wholly separate and distinct logics of communal and class volunteer mobilization and counter mobilization at work in late colonial Bombay, but that there was at least considerable overlap in these processes. At this stage of research, recognizing this overlap allows us to identify processes of volunteer mobilization that emerged later in Bombay's history. In the 1940s, we see a mushrooming of Congress and Hindu militias, along with an expansion of the Sainik Dal, Red, and trade union volunteers against the backdrop of widespread labor unrest. In the 1960s, we see the rise of the Shiv Sena, the communist Krishna Desai's Lok Seva Dal, and the Dalit Panthers, again at a time of widespread labor unrest. In fact, we needn't stop at Bombay. Similar volunteer mobilizations took place during the Telangana armed struggle of the late 1940s in Hyderabad state and the struggle for land in Bihar in the 1980s and 1990s. Could the mobilization of volunteer movements around issues of labor assertion and control be a recurrent pattern in the history of South Asia? I leave you with this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Zain. It has been very precise and focused and quite engaging. Altogether new stuff, because volunteer corps has not yet received as detailed attention as you have sought to bring to fore. We can draw parallel also in the present movements of the time. You may be aware that even the local leader of the Chauri Chaura movement were actually ex-soldiers, and that is what Sahid Amin talks about, that how the ex-soldiers in the Chauri Chaura had played a role in bringing militancy and aggressive stance. So there is absolutely a significant overlap and parallel in South Asian history of peasant and labor history, where the presence of what you are suggesting basically is, I think, and that is what will be my one of the questions to raise, is uh, the a kind of militaristic tendencies uh, within this labor movement, within the movement of the depressed class, in order to counter the militarized form of power that exists around, the militarized form of the authority that they had to confront. So there was a militaristic tendency in organization of these movements from below, whether the working class movement or the depressed class movement, or for that matter, the rural peasant movement. The second is the interface of this militaristic tendency adopted as a strategy with the deep social history of South Asia. Here, the returned soldiers, uh, whether it is the Maratha community or the Mahar community, had expressed themselves in their subsequent life of labor through rejoining of the rejoining of a new military role to serve within the phase of laboring life. And third, what we see also is that, and possibly here you can comment uh, further, that how voluntary corps relate themselves in their day-to-day life with the non-soldier working population. That means, were they establishing a kind of some kind of command chain, some kind of authority versus the rest of uh, population, who who are mediated by the identity of some persons who have the soldierly background constituting the voluntary corps, and those who don't have the soldierly background. In
Right.
another word, how did the militaristic culture or militaristic tendency shape the very relationship between the shape the very the shape the very modality of disciplining within the labor movement, within the movement of the depressed classes. What you have emphasized is the role played by them in not just protecting and countering the overpowering presence of the um, uh, coercive authority, but also in conducting campaign propaganda. But how did all this then constitute a relationship between the ex-soldiers, the on one side, and non-soldierly working population, non-soldierly peasant population for that matter in the rural history on the other hand? So these are some of my concerns that I wish to flag and draw your uh, response to. But now I open this floor for comments and questions from other members who have joined the presentation. So now I invite your comments and questions, those who are present here.
Could I start by responding to your comments?
If you wish, you can respond now. Otherwise,
Yes.
you can collect also. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to, if it's possible, to go one by one.
Okay.
Uh, so yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk. I mean, take a little bit of time to talk about the points that you raised. I mean, I'd like to emphasize that the point that you started with about Chori Chora, about Shahid Amin's image of Congress volunteers who were ex-soldiers who had fought in Flanders and were then involved in the events of Chori Chora with their war medals, which Shahid Amin talks about. We can see also in Punjab at the same time, the Akali movement. In the Akali movement, where the hold of the Mahants over the Gurudwaras and their properties being challenged, we see a number of ex-soldiers in military uniform um, participating in the Akali Jathas in Punjab at this time. Tanta Yong talks about this in his book, Garrison State. And we find this in, if we read the literature of, the interwar period or the Second World War, something even like Rahi Masoom Raza's Adha Gaon, the stamp of the war, and the participation of ex-soldiers in military uniform participating in political movements is very much part of the interwar movement. So, I mean, one of the broader concerns that I have, which didn't come up in this paper but is part of the larger project, which I'd like to mention here, is we look at the historiography of Europe, and we look at the historiography, for example, of Germany. And the interwar historiography of Germany is, the question which is front and center is that of the front generation, the generation which had fought in the war. And so much of politics revolves around that. And yet, when we look at South Asian interwar history, this idea of was there a front generation to come back from the war and which participated in politics as a front generation, as a post-war generation, doesn't come up very often. So it's one of the kind of questions that I'm trying to explore in this project. The second point that you made about were sort of the militaristic tendencies in the labor movement, a response to the kind of militaristic powers that they had to contend themselves with. I mean, I think that's definitely right, but I'd like to also point to the importance of the military as an employer and the importance of military, which for some people, such as for Ambedkar, is a very important engine of social change in colonial India. I mean, I'd like to just read out a very brief quote from Ambedkar at Mahad. The first speech he gives in Mahad, there's a direct quote from him, which says that, and I quote, without hesitation, one can say that the recruitment of untouchables in the military had brought about a revolution in the structure of Hindu society. So the importance of the military, I mean, I think, for example, the Samta Sainik Dal is invoking First World War service, invoking that military parts because of the partial sort of emancipatory effects that it had on the position of Mahars in Western Indian society. So there's that aspect also of it, and then the politics of them not being recognized as a martial race, of their regiment being disbanded, and so on. So there's a sort of historical memory over there, and a historical politics also being played out in the interwar period. I mean, as I mentioned, this is the time also in which Ambedkar, that whole commemoration of the Koregaon Battle Memorial is starting off in the late 1920s. Uh, Finally, kind of your third question about what is the relationship of these volunteer movements to non-ex soldiers who are workers in everyday life. I mean, I thank you for the question. This is something that I need to look into. There is one suggestion that's been made by Eleanor Zelliot in the case, particularly of the Mahar community, which is that Mahars who had served in the army perhaps started constituting something like a subcaste within Mahars in the early 20th century. I mean, and there are suggestions of this in Vasant Moon's memoirs, R.B. Mode's recently published memoirs in English, and also in institutions such as one that I mentioned, the Brigade Caste Panchayat. A caste panchayat of Mahars, which you could only attend if you or your family members had served in the army. So there are interesting things going on within caste communities themselves, within subcaste themselves, which are substantially influenced by having served in the army or not having served in the army. So I don't know about what the daily interactions of the Lal Fauj or the Sapta Sainik Dal were with other workers, but it's definitely something I'll look into. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Jan. Uh, yes, other members who are present here, your comments and questions. Now, floor is open for your input. Anyone?
Hi, this is Akriti Mandwani, and Yeah, thanks for a very lovely talk, and really a pleasure. And I actually wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about, maybe a little bit more about the Desh Sevika Sangh, the sense of the numbers in general. And one other thing that really interests me is, do they also speak about precursor? Because these are women, right? I mean, who are they speaking about when they are, where are they drawing inspiration from? Is there something within the country, or is there kind of international, um, I don't know, sense of the volunteer self which is being made up? So I just wanted to know a little bit more about this part of your talk. But lovely. I mean, thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So just, I mean, on the numbers first, one thing that's been noted by sort of Raza and Roy in talking about volunteer movements is that they had a huge fluctuation in the number of people who were involved. So what tended to happen was that you'd have much larger members when there was a movement going on, and then a steep fall in the number of members who were involved in active training and the activities and so on at other movements. But the Desevika Sangh is a very, very important part of sort of the civil disobedience movement in Bombay, very much at the center of events. I mean, you get the sense that there are definitely hundreds, if not thousands, of Sevikas in the city at that time. There are lists that we have of Sevika Sangh members, but we don't have of prominent members and their backgrounds and so on. But in terms of absolute numbers, we don't have so much, perhaps because of that fluctuating nature of the organization. The historical reference for the Desevika Sangh is, I think, very interesting because they wear saffron saris, and the reference is to Johar, is to the process of self-immolation of Rajput women in the face of an approaching army. I mean, it's a very, very strong statement, and that's kind of the main historical reference that they make. Um, that's all I found. I mean, and there's a lot of emphasis on the color. So the leaflets published by the Dev Sevika Sangh called Jai Kesaria, um, and this kind of this idea of the Rajput warrior is constantly brought up. What exactly does this mean during the civil disobedience movement, which is a time of nationalist mobilization, but we know also in 31 and 32 a time of communal tension in the city? I mean, it's definitely something that needs to be looked into for sort of further research. But yeah, that's all I have in terms of an answer.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
Thanks, Akriti. Uh, any other person?
Dheeraj, I had one.
Yes. Yeah.
Suzanne, I was really impressed with your work. Thank you for an excellent paper. Lots of fun, lots of new food for thought, and lots of things I hadn't really thought about and considered earlier. So, that way it was really nice to listen to you. I was just going to ask a very simple question about Steve Wilkinson's work. Yeah, he talks about the same thing in the context of Second World War and the partition riots. So I wonder how your work speaks to his work. And what are the commonalities? Where do you depart from his work? And he basically looked at a lot of, I think, village records and I think some cemetery records also to find out how people were, who were the military veterans and which villages they belonged to, and things like that. So I think his method was a little different. But other than that, what's the difference between you and him, and what's the connect between you and Wilkinson's work?
Thank you, Professor, for your question. I think, I'm still trying to figure out. I mean, I think that was maybe also in the paper, how to understand this connection between war service and interwar politics. How exactly are the connections made? I mean, from what I remember of Wilkinson's work, I mean, the idea of kind of returning Punjabi soldiers coming back from the Second World War who are trained in kind of military tactics, then getting involved in the partition riot, in partition killing, and the similarities of sort of partition riots to military maneuvers, battlefield maneuvers, and so on. I mean, of course, it's work that is, that sets off all of this thinking about kind of, it set off a lot of ideas for this paper. But I'm interested also in looking at kind of military service from the perspective, as I have in this paper, of different communities. What did not only fighting, not only learning how to be part of the military and battlefield maneuvers mean to for sort of post-war politics, but also the perception of military service itself. As I said, it means something different from Marathas. For the Maratha community, it means something different for the Mahar community. This whole notion also of martial races. What is happening to the notion of martial races in the interwar period? I found a very interesting news item recently while I was kind of doing some of the research for this, in which the martial races themselves tried to put themselves forward as a different constituent section of Indian society at the roundtable conferences. So the development of a kind of interwar identity of that comes out of war service and comes out of this idea of martial races, I think is very important. One other question that I want to pose, which I don't have the answer to, it's just something where I feel it goes beyond or departs a bit from sort of Wilkinson's work, is how much is the category itself of Maratha and Mahar and other categories that we have in the interwar period, how much is that actually shaped by the military? We have something like Prachi Deshpande's work, which talks about the fact that Maratha itself is a category that is extremely unclear in the pre-First World War period. And military recruitment and so on has a lot to do with the sort of clarification and hardening of this community. So I guess all I can say is that, a number of questions have come up, a lot of them inspired by this work that you mentioned, but a lot of other questions have come up just by looking at this connection.
Thank you for that, Zain. Thank you for that also.
Thanks, Aparna. Others? Anyone? Yes, any other member present here may like to? Anita, yes.
Yeah, hi Zen. Thank you so much for a really brilliant presentation. My question is coming from a place of absolute non-expertise, but it is a kind of interest that I'm developing recently, and that has to do with what is happening with the pandemic as the soldiers are returning from the World War I fronts. And I was wondering what is happening to mobilizing of different kinds. Since you are talking about union mobilizing, I was just wondering if you could speak about that. Because what's interesting is that there is very, very little documentation on who's alive, who's dead, who's sick, and how communities are getting affected by this. And I was wondering if the influenza pandemic had an imprint on the kinds of organization that we are seeing at that point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I have to be honest, I simply don't know what the impact of the influenza pandemic was on mobilization in this period. If you'll allow me to, I'd like to kind of talk about the question of health in a more general way.
Absolutely.
One thing that's very interesting to me, and something that was part of this paper, but then I took out, was the rhetoric of, which is very much there, part of union mobilizing and part of the speeches of Lal Fauj members, of the healthy bodies of males who have come from the countryside, who've come from agricultural work, coming to the mill, and then the effect that that has on their bodies, and the sort of loss of manliness that comes from mill work. We know from the testimonies that exist from the 1920s, so this might include sort of the pandemic you're talking about as well. We see testimonies, for example, of Alve. The testimony is one constantly of mill work as intertwined with disease, high fevers, deaths, malaria epidemics, cholera, scattered incidents also of the plague in this period. So that's very much kind of a central part of mill life and mill work. And the only way that I can think of relating kind of today's presentation with volunteer movements and what I've read to the question of health is that of this kind of rhetoric which comes up again and again in the speeches of the time, of the sort of emasculated male body that comes out of mill work and comes out of disease in the city, whereas the village is imagined as a place of kind of health and agricultural work. So I'm sorry I couldn't answer the question directly, but I hope
no, thank you. There is so much of like work that needs to be done just in terms of like the documentation that needs to exist. And since I've just started this work, it seems so kind of so similar to the situation in which we find ourselves today, that beyond like the immediate personal, the imprint of this on the complexity of social organization is just not available. I was reading Laura Spinney's article recently, and she talks about Gandhi being afflicted by the flu, and this is and getting up from his bed to go for a meeting. And I remember as a child reading about Gandhi falling sick here and falling sick there, and it suddenly clicked, and it's like, this is the pandemic. And how interesting that at the time there seems to be no connecting of the dots. And I'm but thank you. This is just a kind of area of interest. So thank you.
Sure. I just like to say two very quick things to that. One is that a friend and a colleague, Dr. Mrunmai Satam, works on industrial health in Bombay in this period, and has been writing about this. And the second is, one thing that I've been working on and off, and I think is also is important from this point of view, is also smaller things. Just the phenomena of the night shift, which comes up in this period, and is a major debate in industrial health in the interwar period. We just don't have histories. We just don't have histories of this because, of course, night shifts are so common. So common now. So there's a plethora of questions. Thank you so much for your question. It's really something to mention.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Anita. Others? Any student? Anjali, Sudipto, Nayan? Okay, so in case someone may like to come, you are definitely welcome to do. But let me then come to a few more observations. Anita is asking, something in the chat box. You can reply.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. See, there are three broad areas in which you have pushed us to think about, and it helps us to expand our historiographical engagement. One is the very significance of voluntary corps. Now, one needs to look at the formation of and deployment of voluntary corps as one of the useful strategies adopted by the labor movement, the depressed class movement, and the present movement, or in your case, labor movement and the depressed class movement. So it's one of the strategies of a struggle, among others that many scholars have examined. So trade union in itself is one of the forms of strategies of a struggle as an organization to mobilize, organize, consolidate the power and all. So within that realm, you have now one more strategies, that's the formation and deployment of voluntary corps in the depressed class movement and the labor movement. The second trade of inquiry that historiographical engagement is that there is a necessary there is now and then attempt in Indian social history or South Asian social history with regard in the form of the realization of selfhood by different communities. In your case, the Maratha and the Mahar, the realization of selfhood through military identity, either by being into the soldierly labor or by adopting that soldierly performance in the non-soldierly life, or by adopting the soldierly status in the everyday political life. So the adoption of the military identity is very enamoring, enchanting for various communities in South Asian history. That is what is the second line of historiographical push we observe here. Third is the fact that the world of working population is formed by people of various variegated backgrounds, and when ex-soldiers join the realm of productive labor, it brings the productive performance, but also it brings militaristic performance, militaristic tendency, and that has bearing on the political expression of the productive classes in their day-to-day life, in their routine political activity. And as a combination of these three, there is a strategical utility of militaristic voluntary corps as realization of selfhood by a few communities by adopting military identity, and third, the influence of the ex-soldiers in the productive in the world of productive labor. As a consequence of the combined three factors, there is a constant not just the constant militarization of the society, but also a valorization of militaristic power, militaristic capacity, which is so widespread in our society. That's a cultural consequence, cultural outcome of these three tendencies that we have seen. So as a result, I see that these are the four direction in which historiographical push is made to what you have just outlined before us, and that's a very significant. And on behalf of Ambedkar University Delhi and History Society, I thank you to help us think in this direction. So before I wind up, anyone would like to raise something? Those who are present here.
Yeah, this is Nayan.
Yes, Nayan. No.
Sorry, my camera was not working earlier. So basically, this is something that Dheeraj sir initially brought up, that what was the correlation between the working class and the non-working class with the military labor. I am working on Northeast India. This is more of an observation, because this is the first time I have actually come across the term volunteer corps for retired soldier laborers. In Northeast India, that after 1918, after the World War, after the Naga labor corps came back, they were instrumental in bringing up the the Naga club, which would go on to initiate the Naga nationalist movement, which is still, as you know, is in Northeast India is a burning question. And so just a little thought that came to my mind, that how does it has in many ways it had to do with the sovereignty movement in Northeast India. And this is something which is very different from North India. I'm not sure how does this contribute to your work, but this is something that made me think how those working class movements correlate sometimes with the non-working class kind of movements. This is a very brief thought that came to my mind. So thank you for your talk. It had to do with my work a little bit. So yeah, thank you.
No, that's yeah.
I think the audio is, I can't hear. Hello? I think I can't hear the audio.
We can't hear you, Zan. Some problem, huh?
Okay.
We are unable to hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Now it's back. Yeah.
Okay, there was some problem. I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much for your comment. I mean, I didn't know that, but what you had said, and it's really fascinating. I mean, I think so. One thing which I think is analogous, perhaps, in what I talked about today, and something which I don't know too much about, but really fascinates me, is this idea of the that when Ambedkar comes to Bombay in the 1920s, he's making contacts and getting to know people and holding meetings through the brigade caste panchayat, which brings together mahars who have served in the military. And so sort of military and ex-military men are setting up these panchayats, clubs, organizations in the interwar period, which is feeding into politics. I mean, like you talked about the, this Naga military club, right?
The Naga.
So, yeah. So, I mean, we we look at something like German history. In German history, we know about the Freikorps, we know about the Kriegersverein. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but we talk about these clubs of ex-soldiers who had fought in the First World War and their pivotal role in the interwar period. But we don't look at this in South Asia. We don't look at what happens to those soldiers. Do they maintain connections with their generals? Do they form these clubs? What is the role of these clubs? And I think one of the reasons why we don't is because, at least in the case of Bombay, you don't find this material in if you read the documents on labor, if you read the archival sources on labor, um, they're mainly written by managers, they're written by members of the state, and they're concerned with labor control. They're not concerned, if you want, with the political culture of labor. It's when you go to the memoirs, when you go to the Marathi novels, the Urdu novels, the Hindi novels, when you go to this different sphere, that these kind of clubs and so on within the neighborhood emerge, you know. So we have a whole world of organizations which perhaps existed beneath in relation to the larger, the Congress, Muslim League, and so on. We have this whole world and network of neighborhood organizations, which we need to bring to the surface and start talking about how that changes our understanding of interwar politics. Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you.
Really illuminating. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Nayan. Any more observation and or question? If not, then let me thank on behalf of all of you who attended and in our university. Thanks, Zen. It has been our pleasure to have you with us and listening to you on this. And we wish to see it as a published paper in, of course, coming time.
Yeah.
And whenever university is freely accessible to everyone, to the wider public, we're looking forward to see you in person and have more conversation on this. Currently, I'm working on the human capital formation in 19th century Western India. So I'm very much interested in Bombay.
Right.
My what to say? My in-laws are also from Bombay. My wife is from Bombay, so it is intimate connection with the city.
Right.
And, yeah. She also works on art history of Bombay. So it's a very close connection with that city and with that area. So surely we will traverse together on some of these things. So it has been so thank you. So Nana is saying thank you for such rich paper. Yeah, thanks Nana for joining this meeting. So we will surely positively look forward to have in-person interaction and more discussion on this. And wishing you good luck and good time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and we look forward to your presence in another activity of our university and History Society in the coming weeks and months. Thank you all, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now I exit. Now I exit Zen. So see you later.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.